Hey guys, this is Arswi. If you have ever held on to a promise thinking you had all the time in the world to keep it, I hope you sit somewhere quiet tonight and listen closely to this story, because the hardest lesson life ever taught me was that forever usually ends on a quiet Tuesday morning without making a single sound. We go through our days assuming the people who held us together will always be sitting right where we left them, just waiting for us to finish being busy. We tell ourselves that true friendship doesn't care about months of radio silence or unreturned calls, that real bonds are immune to the simple crushing weight of passing years. But time is not a bank account where you can deposit love and pick it up decades later untouched by rust. It is a slow, relentless river, and if you do not actively build a bridge back to the people who saved your life, you will wake up one day to find the water is far too wide to swim across. I met Jesse Vance in the humid, dust-choked summer of 2011 at Fort Campbell. We were both 19 years old, terrified and far from home, thrust into the same infantry battalion. There is a very specific kind of brotherhood that forms when you spend 3 straight years sharing cold rations out of a bag, sleeping on gravel, and listening to the low, terrifying hum of mortar fire in the darkness over Helmand Province. You stop seeing where your own identity ends and the other person's begins. Jesse was a tall, lean guy from upstate New York with calloused hands, a slow, quiet laugh, and a steady calm that felt like an anchor whenever the world around us was tearing itself apart. When our contract finally ended and we stepped off the transport plane onto civilian soil, neither of us knew how to exist in a world that wasn't loud and hyper-vigilant. We felt like two ghosts wandering through a room full of living people who couldn't hear us speaking. That first post-military summer, neither of us could stomach the thought of taking an indoor desk job or moving back into our childhood bedrooms. So Jesse found us work as seasonal groundskeepers at Camp Stillwater, a sprawling 70-year-old summer camp nestled along the pine-lined shore of Lake Saganaga. The camp was quiet in May before the children arrived, bathed in the smell of damp earth, sun-bleached cedar, dry hemlock needles, and motor oil from the old outboard engines. For 3 solid months, we spent 12 hours a day scraping, peeling paint off wood cabins, repairing rotted dock planks, clearing brush with heavy axes, and rebuilding stone fire pits along the water edge. It was honest, exhausting work, and for the first time in years, the quiet did not feel heavy or terrifying. It felt like healing on our last night before the camp opened to campers on July 24th. Jesse and I walked down to the far end of the western dock. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin and lake water, and the surface of Lake Saganaga was as black and smooth as glass. We sat on the edge, dangling our work boots over the freezing water, sharing a pot of bitter chicory coffee boiled over a rusted camp stove. Jesse pulled out his worn buck knife, reached under the wooden dock frame, and carved 2 sets of initials into the underside of the heavy hemlock crossbeam, AM for me and JV for him. Right beneath them, he carved a single straight tally mark and wrote a date, July 24th. He turned to me, the amber glow of his cigarette lighting up his tired eyes, and said, "No matter where life takes us, Arswi, no matter how chaotic things get out there in the real world, we come back right here to this dock every July 24th. We boil a pot of black coffee, watch the sun rise over the pines, and carve another mark to prove we're still standing." I looked at him and nodded, making a promise I genuinely intended to keep for the rest of my life. For the first 3 years, that tradition was sacred. In year 2, I was living 3 hours away working an entry-level job at an auto parts distributor. But when July 23rd rolled around, I threw a sleeping bag into my beat-up sedan and drove straight through the night to reach Lake Saganaga by dawn. Jesse was already sitting there on the dock, 2 faded enamel mugs waiting on the wood beside him. We carved our second notch. In year 3, Jesse had moved down near the coast to work in a boat repair yard, but he still made the 6-hour drive north. We sat in the damp morning mist, talked about our lingering nightmares, our stupid young dreams, and carved our 3rd notch into the hemlock beam. That dock became our temple, a quiet sanctuary where we were allowed to drop the heavy armor we wore for the rest of the world and just be 2 boys who had survived the dark together. But life does not pull people apart with dramatic arguments or explosive betrayals. It does it through small, polite shifts in momentum. By year 4, I had taken a corporate logistics role in Chicago. Suddenly, my life was consumed by 60-hour work weeks, endless email threads, mortgage applications, and performance reviews. The city was fast and demanding, and the quiet pine woods of Lake Saganaga began to feel less like a reality and more like a half-remembered dream. When July arrived that fourth year, I was stuck in the middle of a massive quarterly launch. I called Jesse 2 days before the 24th, full of stressed apologies. I told him I couldn't make the drive, that work was choking me, but that we would definitely double up next summer. Jesse paused on the other end of the line, his voice warm and easy as always. "Don't worry about it, brother," he said quietly. "Life gets loud, take care of your business. The lake isn't going anywhere." That was the beginning of the slow drift. Year 4 became year 5. Year 5 rolled smoothly into year 6. Each summer, as July 24th approached, I found a brand new, completely reasonable excuse. A business trip to Denver, a cousin's wedding in Ohio, a leaky roof that needed thousands of dollars in repairs. Every year I promised myself that next year would be the year I finally drove back up to Camp Stillwater. Our phone calls, once weekly 2-hour debriefs about everything under the sun, slowly degraded into brief, polite text messages on birthdays and holidays. "Happy birthday, man. Hope the boat shop is going well. Thanks, Arswi. Hope Chicago is treating you right. Miss you, brother." We were both leaning on the comforting delusion that our bond was so deep, so forged in fire, that time and distance couldn't touch it. We told ourselves that we didn't need to stay in touch, because whenever we finally met up again, we would just pick up right where we left off. 7 years passed without me stepping foot anywhere near Lake Saganaga. 7 years of letting the daily grind consume every square inch of my attention. Then, late last month, on the night of July 23rd, I was digging through a cardboard box in the back of my closet looking for an old jacket. My hand brushed against something soft and heavy at the bottom of the bin, the faded pine-scented army surplus sweater Jesse had handed me on our very last week working at Camp Stillwater. I held it up to my face, and the faint, unmistakable smell of camp smoke and cedar hit me like a physical punch in the chest. I sat down on the cold hardwood floor holding that sweater and suddenly realized what date it was. Tomorrow was July 24th. It had been 7 full years since I had sat on that dock. A sudden overwhelming wave of guilt and unexplainable urgency washed over me. I didn't call him, I didn't text him. I just threw a change of clothes into a bag, grabbed my car keys, and started the long drive north toward Maine before I could talk myself out of it. I drove through the heavy night, watching the highway lines blur under my headlights as the city lights gave way to the endless black wall of northern pine forests. The sun was just beginning to bleed a pale blue across the horizon when I turned down the narrow gravel access road leading into Camp Stillwater. The summer camp season was over for the year, and the entire property was deserted, shrouded in a thick layer of early morning lake fog that hung low over the wooden cabins. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird as I parked the car by the shuttered main lodge and walked down the familiar dirt path toward the water. The tall pines dripped with morning dew, and the crisp air smelled exactly as it had 10 years ago. It felt like walking directly into a memory. I walked out onto the western dock, the old wooden boards groaning softly beneath my boots. The surface of Lake Saganaga was perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky like a massive sheet of ice. I walked to the very end, dropped to my knees on the wet wood, and leaned over the edge to look down under the hemlock crossbeam, fully expecting to see only those 3 lonely tally marks from our youth, frozen in time. But as my eyes adjusted to the shadows beneath the decking, my breath caught in my throat, and my stomach dropped into a cold void. There weren't 3 notches carved into the beam. There were 10 year. 4 was there, year 5, year 6, year 7, year 8, year 9. And right at the end, carved clean and deep into the damp wood, was year 10. Jesse had come back. He had driven up to this lake every single July 24th for 7 long years, sitting alone on this dock in the morning cold, boiling coffee for 2, and carving a mark for a friend who never showed up. Beside the 10th notch, carved freshly into the hemlock, was a small arrow pointing toward the deep knot hole in the supporting wooden piling. Tucked tight inside that knot hole was a waterproof yellow matchbox. With trembling, icy fingers, I pulled the matchbox out, opened it, and pulled out a small piece of lined notebook paper, folded tightly into a square. The handwriting was unmistakable. Jesse's sharp, slanted print. The letter was dated April 14th of this year. "Hey, Arswi," it read. "If you're reading this, it means you finally came home to the lake. I'm sorry I won't be sitting here on the dock with you when you do. 2 years ago, the doctors found a mass in my liver. They called it cholangiocarcinoma. I fought it as hard as I could, man, but it got into my bones and I didn't make it past the spring. I thought about calling you 100 times. I wanted to hear your voice, brother, but I knew you had built a good life in Chicago. You were working hard, building something real, and I knew if I told you I was sick, you would drop everything, abandon your life, and spend your savings sitting by a hospital bed watching me slip away. I didn't want your last memory of me to be a tube in my nose and a pale face on a white pillow. I wanted you to remember us strong, drinking terrible coffee on this dock, watching the mist rise over Saganaga. I came up here early this spring while I could still walk just to carve our 10th notch and leave this note. I never held a single grudge against you for being busy. Arswi, life gets fast and you had a mountain to climb. I just wanted you to know that I kept our promise every single year. I never forgot you, brother. Drink a cup for me. We made it home. The paper shook in my hand as tears finally broke, spilling hot over my cold face. I collapsed backward onto the wet dock boards, clutching that note against my chest, staring up at the gray sky while the quiet wind rustled through the tops of the white pines. He had been gone for 3 months. While I was sitting in sterile, air-conditioned conference rooms worrying about deadlines and metrics, the man who had pulled me through the hell of combat was sitting alone in a small hospice room, quietly dying, keeping my burden off my shoulders until his very last breath. I sat on that dock for 4 hours in total silence, watching the sun cut through the morning fog until the water sparkled like silver. I pulled out my own pocket knife, crawled under the beam, and beneath his 10th notch, I carved a simple word, always. I don't know who needs to hear this tonight, but please listen to me. Don't wait for next summer. Don't assume the dock will stay put or that the people who saved your life will wait forever while you finish being busy. Pick up the phone, make the drive. Say the words before the silence becomes permanent, because the hardest part of losing someone isn't the grief that follows. It's the sudden, agonizing realization of all the time you gave away to things that never mattered at all.